Hello and welcome to the Watchman Report, where we provide perspective to the world news from a biblical standpoint, offering the biblical standard on current events, focusing on prophecy, moral and social issues. And in this episode, we explore about America, a prophetic realignment.
For more than 75 years, European security has rested upon one fundamental assumption: that the United States would stand behind it militarily. NATO has been the central pillar of that arrangement, and American military power has underwritten peace in Western Europe since the end of World War II. Yet that assumption is now being openly questioned. President Trump has made it clear America will not prop up Europe. In one recent report by The Guardian from the 9th of February 2026, entitled Munich Security Conference, Europe Prepares for Life Without US Backing, it was reported that, quote, the message from Munich was clear: Europe must assume America may no longer be its ultimate security guarantor, end quote. Similarly, in another February 2026 article from the BBC News entitled, quote, Europe must prepare to defend itself without the US, leaders warn, end quote, it was stated that, quote, European leaders are increasingly concerned that the US security guarantee can no longer be taken for granted, end quote. The same report noted that there is now, quote, serious discussion in Brussels about developing a fully autonomous European defence capability, end quote. On the 10th of February, the BBC ran another report entitled, quote, Macron urges Europe to start acting like world power, end quote. It was reported that the French president had said, quote, are we ready to become a power? This is the question in the field of economy and finance, in defense and security and democratic systems, end quote. In another article published by Politico under the title, quote, EU defense chief, Europe must build force to replace US troops, end quote, EU Defense Commissioner Andreas Kibileus was quoted as saying, quote, Europe must be ready to take full responsibility for its own defense if the US reduces its presence, end quote. Taken all together, these reports suggest that Europe is contemplating a future, indeed, in which American military dominance on the continent is no longer assumed. Whether this shift develops slowly or rapidly, the direction of travel is clear. Europe is preparing for greater strategic independence from America. It is focused on creating its own defense force. Now, for the Bible student, such developments are not simply political, they are prophetic. The prophecy of Ezekiel chapter 38 describes a confederacy of nations that invades Israel in a time period the Bible calls the latter days. The leader of this confederacy is described as Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince or the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. This invasion takes place after, we're told, Israel has been regathered to their land and are dwelling in relative security. The nations listed being under the rulership of Gog and Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal include the following ancient nations: Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, Gomer, and Togarmah. Now, the Bible student can identify these ancient names with peoples north and east of Israel today, particularly in the regions of Russia and Europe. But how are these identifications made? Well, we have to go back in history to do our best to understand who these ancient nations might be being referred to. Now, one of the key historical witnesses in this discussion is a chap called Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a first century Jewish historian born in AD 37. Now, Josephus wrote extensively about Jewish history and the ancient world. His work, The Antiquities of the Jews, sought to explain Jewish history to a Greco-Roman audience. And as someone living much closer to the biblical era and familiar with ancient traditions and history, his identifications are significant for historical geography. Josephus wrote, quote, "Magog founded those that from him were named Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called Scythians." The Scythians were a powerful group of peoples who inhabited the vast territories north of the Black Sea. Classical writers, such as the Greek Herodotus, described Scythia as stretching from the Danube River in Eastern Europe across to the Don River and beyond. In other words, their territory covered much of what we now recognize as Eastern Europe and southern Russia. These peoples are the Magogites, the Scythians of Ezekiel 38. If Josephus is of course correct, then Magog does correspond to that ancient Scythian world. That places Magog squarely in the region of Eastern Europe and southwestern Russia, the territory of modern-day Ukraine being at the heart of it. Now, Ezekiel also describes Gog as the chief prince, or as the Hebrew renders it, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. The identification of Rosh has been associated with the historical roots of Russia. Historical records from the 9th and 10th centuries refer to a people called the Rus, or the Rosh, or the Rus, who operated in the regions of modern Russia and Ukraine. Byzantine and Arab writers mention them by name, and over time the name Rus or Rus developed into Russia or Russia. Now, while there is some linguistic debate about this, the historical continuity of the name is notable. Meshech and Tubal are generally identified with ancient peoples living in the regions south of Russia around the Caucasus. Classical sources refer to tribes such as the Moskai and the Tibereni in these areas, and over time, migration northward contributed to the population of the Russian lands. Even the name Moscow has often been linked historically with Meshech. Thus, the core leadership of the Ezekiel 38 confederacy of Gog and Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, aligns geographically with the territories of Russia and its surrounding regions. These are the leaders of the great northern confederacy, says the prophet, that come down upon Israel after Israel has been regathered to its land. However, the confederacy in Ezekiel 38 does not simply consist of eastern peoples. Amongst others, it also includes a people called Gomer and all his bands. Josephus identifies Gomer with the Galatians, a western tribe of Galatians. Classical writers described how the Galatian people migrated into Western Europe, and over time these groups became associated with the regions that now include France and parts of Germany. Standard historical references have connected Gomer with the early Celtic and European branches of these people. In other words, Gomer represents Western Europe. Now, when Ezekiel lists both Magog, Eastern Europe and southern Russia, and Gomer, Western Europe, the implication is that Europe, broadly speaking, forms part of the latter-day confederacy. Europe is not depicted as resisting the Russian Gog. They are led by Russia and are within the Northern Military Alliance when it invades Israel. I want to throw one more thing into the mix. The book of Revelation adds another important piece to the picture. In Revelation 17, we read symbolically of 10 kings who have one mind and give their power and strength unto the beast. Now, Revelation is a book of symbol, and it's long been understood that the beast of Revelation represents a revived Roman or European political system. The 10 kings are European powers who unite and consolidate authority. The striking detail is that they give their power, they pool their sovereignty. The image is not necessarily of one of violent conquest, but of political alignment and consolidation. A unified Europe bloc operating with its own mind is entirely consistent with the structure described in Ezekiel 38. If Europe becomes more strategically independent and internally cohesive, the framework for such unity becomes easy to envisage. The prophecy indicates that these European powers will become under the control of the Russian authority in the latter days. They are not part of the American NATO confederacy as we have it today. They have to change their alliance. They have to change their leadership from looking to America to looking to Russia. Now, Ezekiel 38 verse 13 also mentions another block of nations. It talks to us about the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof. This group do not join Gog's invasion. Instead, it seems that they question it. They ask, "Art thou come to take a spoil?" Tarshish can be identified with the maritime trading power of Britain and her young lions, her political offspring nations, which would include the United States. So the implication here is that these Anglo-maritime powers stand apart from the Russian, European, Gogian confederacy. And they do not participate in the invasion of Israel, but neither do they prevent it. If Europe ultimately aligns under a northern Russian power, then Britain and America must, in some way, stand outside of that arrangement. Precisely how such a separation would occur is not specified in the prophecy. Scripture does not describe all the steps, but it does give us a picture of the final alignment and not the pathway to that. However, if the United States reduces its military footprint in Europe, as it said it would, and if Europe moves towards independent defense structures, as it's saying it will, the structural separation that prophecy requires becomes conceivable. The scene is being set for the Russian Gog to enter the world scene, to dominate Europe and take up its destiny as the head of the enemies of Israel. And we see a militant Russia. We see a strong Russia doing what we would expect. What we're waiting for is that shift from the European powers toward Russia. Now, it would be wrong to claim, of course, that every political development that we see in our news stories equals a direct and an exact prophetic fulfillment. Bible prophecy should not be forced onto daily headlines, but at the same time, prophecy does describe a particular end configuration before Jesus returns. It describes Israel restored to their land, which we can see has happened 1948, 1967. The Jews are back. It does describe a northern power leading a confederacy. We see a strong northern Russian power emerging on the world scene. We see it says that there will be a Europe included under that confederacy. We see it tells us that Anglo-maritime powers will be standing apart from that. It tells us that all the nations in that Gogian confederacy will be gathered against Jerusalem for battle until there's a divine intervention through the Lord Jesus Christ when he returns with his saints to establish God's kingdom. Now, Israel has been regathered, as I've said. Europe is reconsidering its military structure. Russia does remain the dominant military force in Europe's east. America is publicly debating the extent of its European commitment. We do not know the precise sequence of future events, but the direction of travel is worthy of attention. So, in conclusion, the post-war order that shaped the modern West is not guaranteed to endure indefinitely. Alliances are shifting, power balances are changing, nations are reassessing their priorities, and the Bible asserts that in the latter days, this northern confederacy will move against Israel and God will intervene decisively. Russia will pick up that mantle as leading Europe. Europe will indeed be part of that confederacy. Ezekiel 38, Revelation 17 have told us this. Changes in European military identity are not therefore merely political curiosities. They are steps, gradual or otherwise, toward the arrangement Scripture has described, and they are heading us towards the restoration of God's kingdom on the earth. The prophet Ezekiel has declared God's words in Ezekiel 38 verse 23. He says, "Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord, that I am Yahweh." History is moving us toward that moment, and the wise will be watching. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found that interesting.
Thanks for staying with us for this report. We pray that the video report has provided some clarity to the situation in the Middle East. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and select all so you never miss a new upload. Don't forget to like, share and drop a comment in the comment section. We love to hear your thoughts. Make sure you follow our playlist and never miss a new report. Until next time, God willing, this has been the Watchman Report, bringing perspective to current world news from a biblical standpoint. Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching. And remember to come back soon.